Hi, Brian.
Hi.
So what we are going to discuss today is there a possibility of foreign policy shift in the U.S. after these U.S. elections, congressional and Senate elections that we know that now Republicans control both houses of the U.S. Congress?
I honestly don't think so. I can explain why. I mean, put this in a little bit of context. Most administrations are weak at midterm. So this is not an unusual phenomenon that a president at midterm in his first or second term loses seats in Congress and loses sometimes a lot of seats in Congress. President Obama happened to lose quite a lot of seats in Congress this time and lost control of the Senate. But I don't see this causing a big shift in foreign policy. In foreign policy in the United States, the levers are really in the hands of the president. It's the one place that the president can do a lot of things without Congress. I mean, all treaties have to be passed and ratified by the Senate, of course, and that's important. So I don't see a major shift, and the Senate, of course, has a lot more control over foreign policy than the House of Representatives, the lower house. But even if you look at the committee chairmanships that have changed now, the Foreign Affairs Committee will be Bob Menendez will be stepping down, will not be chairman anymore. It'll be Bob Corker will take this. But if you look at there, well, Menendez and Corker are actually have a fairly good working relationship, a very good working relationship, and they actually co-sponsored a bill that would have increased sanctions on Russia and given military aid to the Ukrainians. So you don't see a big shift there. You see, because as a Democrat, Menendez is pretty much for a strong and robust military. If you look at the Armed Services Committee, well, Carl Levin, the Democrat from the current chairman, Carl Levin, Democrat from Michigan, is retiring. That will be taken over by John McCain, who I think everybody knows who that is.
This is
well,
obvious
Levin's
McCain
also
will be asking tougher, sanctions for tougher sanctions, tougher measures
Levin,
against Russia.
Levin's also been asking for tough measures against Russia.
I'm going to now quote from Bob Corker. Yeah, he says, talking about Obama's foreign policy, he says, rather than react to the events as they unfold, which has been the policy of this administration, we need to inflict more direct consequences on Russia prior to Vladimir Putin taking additional steps that will be very difficult to undo. He said that. And he always criticized it. He says Europe is feckless.
You're going to see a shift in rhetoric. You're definitely going to see a shift in rhetoric. John McCain's going to be much louder about these issues than Carl Levin was. Carl Levin's a very soft-spoken man. But Carl Levin has been sponsoring legislation to give military aid to the Ukrainians and to make tougher sanctions on Russia. So there's not a lot of difference when you get into the meat of the policy between these heads of the committee chairmen, the new heads of the committees and the old heads of the committees. So we're going to see a lot more criticism of the administration coming out of the Senate. But in terms of policy, I don't see a lot of change. One area where we're going to have to keep our eye on, and this is Iran, because the administration clearly wants a deal with Iran. A deal with Iran is getting closer and closer, perhaps. The deadline is coming up next week for the nuclear
conflict between Republicans and Obama, right?
Yeah, the Republicans do not want a deal. McCain certainly doesn't want to deal with and this is going to be difficult because the Senate can obstruct this possibly, but there's also talk that the administration might try to find ways to lift some sanctions against Iran outside of the Senate. So, but there's another interesting point here that I think we really have to bear in mind, is that Republicans like McCain and Corker and Burr, they want a tough line in Iran and they want a tough line on Russia. Well, guess what? Doing both is pretty hard. And if sanctions are lifted on Iran, if relations with Iran are normalized, that's really going to hurt Russia. Here's why. Because Iran has the ability to supply a lot of energy to Europe and could become a replacement supplier to Russia. And this would be, if you want to get tough with Russia, one of the ways to do that is to make peace with Iran. Now this is politics. We're not talking, you have to deal with one devil or the other. But there's going to be some choices that are going to have to be made here.
The very word of saying peace with Iran will not be
well,
really
I know,
popular in Washington these days, right?
Well, it's popular among some people in Washington. The geopolitical reality is that if you normalize relations with Iran, it has the potential to make life very, very, very difficult for Moscow. And if you really want to get tough with Moscow, you cut off their energy money. And one way to cut off there's a lot of ways to cut off their energy money. Europe diversifying its supplies, shale gas, renewables, liquefied natural gas. All these things are in the pipeline, so to speak. But if Iran suddenly becomes a key energy supplier to Europe, and a lot of pipelines need to be built for this to happen, but from my understanding is that the Europeans are quite keen for this to be the case. If you normalize relations with Iran, lift sanctions, that's going to hurt Russia. So that you have two different geopolitical strands here. Now, yeah, the Republicans want to be tough on both, but sometimes in geopolitics, you have to deal with one devil to fight another devil. This is
okay, Brian. How about I think we're talking not only about Russia but also about former Soviet Union as former Soviet republics, and here's Bob Corker, who he sponsored with 22 Republicans legislation which was calling to strengthen NATO and provide military support to non-NATO allies like Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova. These are the guys who are initiating these things. You say it was co-sponsored with Bob Menendez. I agree with you, but it comes from Republicans, because Republicans are the guys who are really
like I said, Harry,
concerned about
we're going to see a change. We're going to see a change in
resurrection
rhetoric.
of Russian
We're going to see
empire.
a change in rhetoric. We're going to see much more criticism from the Senate, but there's not a lot of daylight on the policy between the policies here. So I don't see, for a couple of reasons, I don't think we're going to see it. Like I said in the beginning, the president really does hold the levers in foreign policy. That's number one. But number two, there's not much daylight between Bob Menendez and Bob Corker on these issues. There's not much daylight in terms of policy between Carl Levin and John McCain, actually.
Let's talk about John McCain. He's a different guy. He's like a Georgian guy.
McCain's
he's so pro-Georgian.
McCain is going to have a higher profile, and McCain has been a strong advocate.
This guy goes to Maidan and talks in Maidan. He's different. You cannot say that there will be no policy change.
Policy change.
They can enforce the policy change if they want to. Can't they?
They can put pressure on the administration. But like I said, but I think what we're going to see is a change in rhetoric. I think the administration is not opposed to being tough with Russia on this situation, and I think the sanctions the administration has posed are very tough, if you ask me, from the United States. The Europe sanctions are a little softer.
Yes.
But what really do you propose we do short of going to war with nuclear-armed Russia?
Yeah.
Really, it's very easy to talk when you're talking from the Senate and you don't have the ultimate responsibility that the president has. But what are the president's options really in this situation? Do you want to go to war with a nuclear-armed Russia? Well, nobody does. And nobody's even talking about it. So we're talking about tough sanctions. We have tough sanctions. Yeah. This is why I'm saying the change is going to be stylistic. The change is going to be
support the countries that, around Russia.
Yeah, and you're going to see, what will be interesting is if the Congress passes a bill calling on for the United States to give military aid to Ukraine. Does the administration veto it? That's a very interesting question. It's a very interesting question. It'll be interesting to watch.
And how do you read the situation in Georgia? All this, sudden dismissal of government officials, European, very European-minded ministers. Is there any significance to?
Yeah, there's a lot of significance to this, but I think it has more to do with domestic Georgian politics than foreign affairs.
To do with
Well, no. What sparked this all was the firing of Irakli Al-Hassania as defense minister. Irakli Al-Hassania is one of the most pro-Western figures in the Georgian government. But let's face it, the whole Georgian government is pro-Western.
Yeah.
But Irakli Al-Hassania has been kind of the face of this pro-Western drive. But he's also somebody who is very, very, very trusted in Brussels and in Washington. I saw this at the NATO summit in Cardiff when I attended the NATO summit. Mr. Al-Hassani was treated very well. He's seen by Western leaders as one of us, basically.
Don't you think that this is the reason why he was fired?
No, I don't think this is the reason he was fired. I think the reason he was fired has more to do with the fact that he's is quite an independent player in the coalition, that Bidzina Ivanishvili, who doesn't hold a post in Georgia, but who is the founder of the Georgian Dream Coalition, didn't like that. I think it has to do with the fact that Al-Hassani's popularity in Georgia has been going up because he's done quite a good job at the defense ministry. He got Georgia to where the Georgian Armed Forces now is the most interoperable force of all NATO's non-NATO member allies. It's Georgia is the most interoperable force, and he got Georgia to the brink of NATO membership. The next step for Georgia is membership. This is stated policy in Georgia to get Georgia into NATO. So I don't think this was the underlying reason. I think the underlying reason was a personal conflict between him and Mr. Ivanishvili. But I think this is now has the risk of breaking up the coalition. But it also might have a very positive impact because I think this coalition was very artificial. It was everybody who wanted to get rid of Mikhail Saakashvili, a very broad coalition going from nationalists all the way to socialists. The only thing they had in common was they wanted to get rid of Saakashvili, and they did. But other than that, they don't have a lot in common. This coalition is very, very, very broad. And now it may break up. The government may fall. We'll see. The situation's unfolding.
Do you think this change is just benign phenomenon that had no...
You're asking me if I see the hand of Moscow in this?
Yeah.
The answer is no.
I mean, I can see that this guy was so pro-Western, pro-NATO, that he was fired maybe to diversify, to balance the foreign policy.
Georgia is pro-Western and Georgia is pro-NATO. So I don't think this is. If you want to look for the reason, I think you have to look elsewhere. I certainly think Moscow is going to try to exploit this, and there are certainly people in the coalition who favor. It's not a choice for them between Moscow and the West. The Western course is fixed. It's between. How much do we want to accommodate Russia? How much do we want to kind of have good relations with Russia? And they're mainly talking about trade relations, by the way. Nobody's talking about Georgia joining the customs union, for example. The debate is how fast and how deeply do we integrate with the West. So no, I think Mr. Al-Hassani's views reflect the views of a majority of Georgians and the majority of the political class, and the majority of the parliament and the majority of the coalition, that Georgia's going west. That's where they want to go. So if you want to, the reasons for this scandal, I think you have to look elsewhere. What's disturbing is the fact that removing Mr. Al-Hassani from the scene, he was so trusted in Brussels and so trusted in Washington that the West may be less receptive to Georgia when you remove this person that they trusted so much. And that's so I don't see a Moscow
criticism from Washington saying that you don't have to use like judiciary to get rid of the politicians that you don't favor.
Yeah.
And now, what do you think about Kerry, John Kerry?
What do I think?
Will he stay?
I'm not going to. Predictions are a fool's game here, but I mean, I'm expecting a shakeup in Obama's foreign policy team. Whether that shakeup will include the Secretary of State, I honestly don't know. But what I will say is I do expect the foreign policy team to be shaken up. There's a consensus in Washington right now that this foreign policy team is not working properly. It's not getting the proper information to the president. It's not functioning efficiently. So I'm expecting a shakeup in the foreign policy team. Who the big victim is going to be, I don't know. If it's going to be Secretary of State Kerry, if it's going to be Secretary of Defense Hagel, if it's going to be National Security Advisor Rice. I don't know who the victim is, but I'm expecting a shakeup.
Very controversial, suggestion of. There was a title, I read that the biggest winner of the Democratic defeat will be Hillary Clinton. What what do you make of that?
Well, I mean,
How this will this increase the chances of Hillary Clinton becoming?
well, Hillary Clinton certainly is the front runner to become the Democratic nominee. And right now, the demographics of the electoral map favor the Democrats in presidential elections. The Republicans tend to win midterm elections because the turnout's lower. And the demographic that turns out for midterm elections tends to be older, tends to be whiter, and that favors the Republicans. That alone didn't account for this. There's a lot of disaffection about the administration, particularly in foreign policy, from its own base. But in presidential elections, when you have the full electorate coming out, it doesn't look good. So the Democrat is usually favored right now with the current electoral map. That can change, but right now, to win presidential elections. And so I would say right now Hillary is the favorite to win both the Democratic nomination and the presidency. Now, a lot depends on who's going to be the Republican nominee. If the Republicans put up a good nominee, I mean, Jeb Bush, for example, is
think another Bush is possible?
I think Jeb Bush is possible. And Jeb Bush is somebody who, in temperament and policy, more resembles his father than his brother. And so, if they put up a moderate like Jeb Bush, I think the Republicans might have a good chance to beat Hillary in the general election. But I'm not sure I see the logic of how this will help Hillary. I mean, what was the argumentation of this article? I don't know I'm trying to think. I don't want to put words in the author's mouth, but I don't know if this is going to help or hurt Hillary. If Hillary wants to be the Democratic nominee, I'm expecting her to be the Democratic nominee. There's not really a lot. There's other names out there. Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, is the one that's often cited as a potential alternative to Hillary. But she hasn't announced yet. And she's not getting any younger. But right now, if you ask me to predict on this day, yes, I expect Hillary to be the front runner for the Democratic nomination, and I expect her to be a slight favorite to win the presidency, depending, of course, on who becomes the Republican nominee. I think Jeb Bush would be a very strong challenger, and let's face it, the media would love Bush Clinton. Again, in an election. I mean, that would be something the American media would just eat up.